I'm going to make a start, if we can turn the webcam on. Okay, good evening, everyone. Can I draw your attention to item 1, the filming at meetings notice? Please note that this meeting may be filmed or recorded by the Council for live or subsequent broadcast via our internet site or by anyone attending the meeting using any communication method. And although we ask members of the public recording, filming or reporting on the meeting not to include the public seating areas, members of the public attending the meeting should be aware that we cannot guarantee that they will not be filmed or recorded by others attending the meeting. Members of the public participating in the meeting should be aware that they are likely to be filmed, recorded or reported on. By entering the meeting room and using the public seating area, you're consenting to being filmed and to the possible use of those images and sound recordings. As chair of the meeting, I have discretion to terminate or suspend filming or recording if, in my view, continuation of the filming, recording or reporting would disrupt or prejudice the proceedings, infringe the right of any individual or may lead to a breach of a legal obligation by the Council. With all of that in mind, do we have apologies for absence?
Chair, we have apologies for absence from Councillor Ejiofor and Councillor Ahmet.
I've also just had apologies from Councillor Goldberg, who's stuck on a tube. Okay. Does anyone need to make a declaration of interest? No? Okay. Item 4, then. Matters referred to Cabinet by the Overview and Scrutiny Committee. Councillor Wright. Just to say on this item, Councillor... Oh, you are already sat there. So this is a special meeting of the Cabinet held to reconsider the decision on the Haringey Development Vehicle financial close and establishment. As you all know, as Cabinet members, there was a call-in considered by the Overview and Scrutiny Committee at its meetings on the 17th of July, where they decided to refer the decision back to Cabinet for reconsideration. And we're doing that within 5 working days as per Part 4, Section H of the Constitution. So what we'll do is consider the recommendations of ONS set out at page 2 of the agenda pack, and I'll ask Councillor Strickland to provide a verbal response to the recommendations. Given that this was a key decision previously agreed following consideration of the exempt information at the 3rd of July Cabinet meeting, and response to the scrutiny recommendation do not require further reference to the exempt part of the report, can Cabinet members confirm that they do not require discussion of the exempt material? Is that agreed? Okay. Councillor Wright, when you're ready, if you can report on the outcome of ONS meeting and let us have your take, please.
Thanks, Chair. Yeah, we're reaching the end game of this, I guess, at, sort of through the council and committee process, and the scrutiny committee, the scrutiny panel in particular, has spent many hours going through this. I'd just like to thank actually the scrutiny committee members and the members of the Housing and Regeneration Scrutiny Panel for their work on it, and also officers who've spent many hours also answering questions on this. It's right that an issue like this gets full scrutiny, and I think we've come a long way in the processes that we've been through on this. And the recent meeting the other day was similarly a long meeting, and a lot of issues raised. Particularly, I think around risk. It's been a theme throughout this debate, and I think that's right. Initiatives, policies, programmes like this do carry risk, and it's right that we look at that and consider what position we need to take on this. At the end of the day, these are public policy decisions, and it's important. I think it's been important throughout our deliberations that the public policy outcomes are paramount, and that is in the context of the financial position and the policies that exist from under the present government, that we do look both to increase the numbers of housing, to offer appropriate and firm guarantees to people who are displaced, and overridingly to look at increasing the numbers of social housing in the borough, as well as housing overall, because we have an overriding commitment and obligation, I think, to, for example, the 3,000 families in temporary accommodation on our waiting list, and the further numbers on the waiting list again. And so those issues have been paramount in our discussions, and to a large extent those considerations are why this has gone back and back again, I think. The particular recommendations that we make in respect of the decision you're retaking tonight is therefore precisely clarification of what the overall numbers of social homes at target rent will be, initially for the Site 1 allocations which will go in, as well as a clear commitment to a net increase in homes available for social housing at target rent. If this proposal goes through, that has to be a paramount consideration for the policies that the Council wants to take forward. There are people in this borough who have been failed by the housing market. That's abundantly clear. And if we cannot address that issue in this proposal, then it shouldn't be going forward. Similarly, a clear commitment to the prioritisation of the absolute right of return. I think we had long discussion on this. There was concern over the wording in the documents that we saw. They weren't clear. There was a confusion around one move or right of return, the tenant's rights in that respect. And if we don't get that clear here, then again, we shouldn't be going forward. The other point is exclusivity. There's a lot of concern about the exclusivity arrangement with Lend-Lease on the construction side of things. There's some previous evidence that to do this on a site-by-site basis rather than an overall exclusivity arrangement would be the right thing in order to ensure that those buildings provides value for money and can be monitored through the process. Similarly, what happens with these homes? We think a wholly owned company should be established in order to buy up the social rented units, the units at target rents, because that will secure the public interest in housing which is for the public good. There's a further point about the social impact vehicle and the member that might be appointed to sit on that. I think it was considered that this is a separate and distinct role from the role of the member which it's proposed to sit on the overall board. There are distinct and specific considerations there. It's a proposal which offers a lot of benefits for the borough, but that has, we think, to be overseen on a governance basis by a councillor, not the same councillor who sits on the overall board, so that those considerations can be taken forward without any conflict. Similarly, scrutiny. We've had a lot of discussion on this. It's clear that as the current position exists, the council is subject to the scrutiny process. Business plans which are agreed on the council side will be subject to the scrutiny process. But an arrangement like this, which covers so much of the regeneration activity which it's proposed this borough is doing, we think that the HDV staff themselves should agree to attend and engage fully in the scrutiny process to give that check that we absolutely need. I think that this process is moving forward in the ways that it should be. And finally, this point about the commercial portfolio. There's some concern that there are buildings in the commercial portfolio which are in reality in community use. There's a need, we think, to disaggregate that portfolio. Buildings, as we know, have gone into one side of that divide or the other in a way which isn't particularly clear. And as we have a community buildings policy and a community buildings portfolio, we think that there are certain, not a large number, but there's a significant number of buildings which in reality are in community use. They serve the public. They have social and community value, and that an exercise should be undertaken to assess those and possibly look at moving them out of the commercial portfolio into the community buildings portfolio before there's any transfer, and that would offer significant safeguards to those organisations which are serving the public good in Haringey. I'm going to leave it there. I'll take any questions on that, but we'd welcome the response from the Cabinet member on the points that we've made. Thank you.
Thanks, Councillor Wright. If you're okay to turn your microphone off, and I'm going to ask Councillor Strickland to respond.
Thank you very much, and I also want to add my thanks to the work of the committee. So on Monday we had, I think it was just over 5 hours of intensive scrutiny, where everyone was working very hard. But I also wanted, as Charles said, coming to the end of the scrutiny process, also to thank the council staff, but also the security here, and also the police, who similarly had some very, very long evenings, and obviously grateful for their work. So thank you for your recommendations, Charles, and the committee. If I can just run through them one by one. So the first question then was a request essentially for a sort of definite number of social homes in phase one. So as we said on Monday, what we're not able to do at the moment is to give a definite number for what would be built on each site in the early phases. And as I mentioned, that's because we have to undertake further consultation with residents. We have to talk to residents further about what they want to see. This is not just about homes, it is about community facilities and other things. So that master planning work has to happen. But what we are clear on is of the 6,400 homes in Category 1, at least 40% of those will be affordable. Replacement homes under the right to return are obviously provided at equivalent social rents, and that's guaranteed in perpetuity, as we've said before. And additional affordable homes built on top of those replacement homes are built in accordance with what's set out in the housing strategy. We've made very clear as a Labour Council that we do not agree with government policy that recommends setting rents up to 80%. That's why in the housing strategy we make very clear we expect to see most affordable home rents well below that level. It's also important to say on this that what the papers make clear on page 34, and I'll just read this directly, Chair, is that in agreeing the suite of legal documents into the business plans, the Cabinet is not being asked to decide whether any part of Northumberland Park or Cranwood is to be disposed of to the HGV. And that's because, as it later says, such decisions will only be made following community consultation, including statutory consultation, and further equalities impact assessments. So the report makes clear that Cabinet is not making a detailed decision tonight. That's why we can't give detailed numbers before we've spoken more fully to residents. The second point then, in terms of the commitment on right to return. So I think this is a very good point that was raised by the committee. The documents were drafted to make clear that the right to return has absolute priority, but there was a section of the report, as Charles quite rightly says, where the wording was a bit ambiguous. It didn't convey the meaning it was intended to, and I've asked that that be redrafted to make absolutely clear. The third issue then on the exclusivity arrangement. So the request was for site by site. So we have, as Charles said, we have talked about this at previous scrutiny meetings, and we have had a long, hard think about this. Now, our view is that we can't agree this recommendation for a couple of reasons. The first is that we are seeking to partner with a developer, because we want them to develop. We want them to build things. So it's not unreasonable. It is not unreasonable, therefore, that the arrangements would involve Lend-Lease, obviously, building significant things on our behalf. But also, we talked at the last Cabinet meeting in some detail about the landmark agreements that we are proposing on job skills, apprenticeships and economic development. Now, obviously, that overall agreement works if you have an overall arrangement for how things are being built. If we move to a site-by-site exclusivity arrangement, it would be very, very difficult indeed to similarly have an overall agreement on jobs and skills, and that's obviously a huge priority for us. The next recommendation then was to establish a wholly owned company to buy up social rent units. Two things to say there. The first thing is that the Head of Housing is already doing some work to look at whether we should set up a company, but that's primarily being looked at to purchase properties to help us with the temporary combination problem. Now, clearly, there is an option for the council to use such a company to buy back homes, or in fact the council to buy back homes itself. But that will need to be looked at in the future when we're a bit clearer on the different phases. The next one then on a councillor being appointed to the social impact vehicle and it being different to the board member. I think this is a good idea, but again, because we haven't even begun to discuss the governance of the social impact vehicle, again, this is something that we will have to come back to in the future, but where there'll be obviously full discussion with members, and I think there'd probably have to be agreement from Cabinet anyway, so it would all be done in a very transparent way. On the obligation for senior HGV staff to come to scrutiny, that's no problem at all, and it's quite right, of course, that senior staff from the HGV should come to scrutiny and be open to questions as other external partners are. The last one then was on buildings that are currently in community use. Now, what's I think really important to clarify, and I think this has caused some confusion, is that there is a separation between the council's community buildings portfolio and buildings that are in the commercial portfolio being rented at commercial rents, which happen to be rented by a charity or some sort of third sector organisations. So that's the first thing to say. So the second thing then to build on that is to say that none of our community buildings are going in to the HGV. That's never been proposed, and that's certainly not in this paperwork. Now, in terms of what's recommended here, in terms of looking at social and community value, seeking to protect them, a lot of work is going on at the moment to look at potential impacts of all property transferring. The commercial property business plan makes clear there are provisions in place to protect charities, childcare providers, places of worship, public functions, or tenants who might be vulnerable or disadvantaged, even if they're running an entirely private enterprise. And equality impact assessments will be undertaken to mitigate any negative impact. But what we don't think it would be sensible to do is to withdraw some of the buildings from the commercial portfolio. As I said, most of these building users have chosen to rent a commercial property from us. They are paying commercial rent, and many of them have been doing so on commercial terms for some time. So for those reasons, we don't think it's sensible to separate them out. But as I say, there's significant work going on to make sure that all tenants are protected and don't face negative impacts.
Thank you. I've had notification of some questions. So as you're sort of sat in a line there, Councillor McNamara, Councillor Ibrahim and Councillor Carter, if you want to come forward, there are 3 microphones here. You may need to bring a couple of chairs, I'm afraid. If we take your question or questions in turn, and then I'll get your responses to those, and then we'll move on to Councillor Brabazon, Councillor Tucker and Councillor Hare. Oh, sorry, Councillor Connor, I hadn't had notification from you. I'll take you as in the second round, that's fine. OK, Councillor McNamara.
Thank you, Chair. I want to ask a question that has been raised in terms of a concern by residents in my ward of Bruce Grove. So recommendation F within section 3 of the overview and scrutiny report of the call-in meeting on the 17th of July refers to scrutiny. And I'd like to ask how this recommendation can be successfully met, taking into account my questions at Cabinet on 3rd of July in relation to transparency, access to minutes and rights of public attendance, what with confirmation both by Councillor Strickland and the Director of Housing and Growth that meetings of the HTV company will not be open to the public and meetings and papers will not be in the public domain, raising the logical question as to how scrutiny of the proposed HTV will work, and further to the ONS committee making this recommendation for full engagement of senior officers in the scrutiny process. An example I would draw on of this would be the financial implications of a council-generated event as opposed to a private sector provider-generated event, and information that was drawn out at recent public meetings about the 10% above market value premium that the council would need to pay to exit from a future set-up HDV company in terms of the value of the land that was placed in it. And the fact that this only emerged very recently, despite 10 months of intense scrutiny work.
So, Councillor Amina Ibrahim, I'm Labour Councillor for Haringey Ward. I've got two questions. One is relating to page 65. So, if you could have a look at that at point 6.101, and this is in relation to the recommendation on the wholly owned vehicle. So I'll just read that out. For ease of understanding and avoiding complexity based on as yet unknown options, the Yeah, is that all right? Sorry. Okay. So, how does that? How is that impacted by our recommendation on a wholly owned vehicle to buy up the social rented properties, and what would the impact of that be? Because that seems to exclude that as a possibility. And my second question is, in relation to the overall considerations, what is the date or the rough time frame for the signing of the legal agreements?
Thank you, Chair. I have three questions. The first one is there any update, please, on the letter that was sent out to the 435 addresses in Northumberland Park? These are the privately owned houses, I think. That's the first question. Second question, can the Cabinet offer any assurance that the Council will not enter into any binding legal agreements in respect of the HDV during the 3-month period for a JR? And there's a related question to that, which is, if there is a change of Cabinet or overall administration in May, and the judicial review does not halt the HDV, will we by May have entered into those binding legal agreements, and if so, how much would it cost a different administration to exit after May? And the last question, in respect of the judicial review, has there been any legal advice as to the chances of the HDV prevailing or winning or whatever? Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to just turn to the number of questions there that were raised which concerned legal issues. So just turn to the monitoring officer on that very briefly, and then I'll come to you, Councillor Strickland, and any officers that you want to nominate.
Obviously, where we get letters or purported challenges coming in, or pre-action protocol letters, we take advice on the likelihood of success, but this wouldn't be the forum to talk about that. But you know, we will defend obviously any claims brought, and we're confident we would succeed.
Councillor Strickland, the legal issues dealt with. Can I ask you to come back on the other?
Thank you very much. So, Councillor McNamara, so the scrutiny point is a very important one. So, as we've said, HGV staff obviously would come to scrutiny, could be called to scrutiny. I take your point and your concern in terms of board minutes and their availability. But what I would say is that I've seen very good scrutiny by the various panels of people like Veolia, other organisations whose board minutes scrutiny doesn't receive, but nonetheless I've seen very tough scrutiny of them. It's also important to say that, remember that the major decisions around which sites go in, what would be built on them, how many homes, percentage of affordable, the presence of other community facilities, all of those decisions have to come to Cabinet, and therefore scrutiny will be able to scrutinise on the basis of detailed documents that were coming through the political process in the normal way. Councillor Ibrahim, in terms of your... Sorry, let me pick up Councillor Carter's point. So, in terms of an update on letters, I think the Council's position is as was set out by the Director of Regeneration on Monday. So the question was, were people written to? And Lynn's answer was, yes, they were as part of the Area Action Plan process that took place. And then, Leader, if I can, I'll ask Dan to answer the question on Councillor Ibrahim's question on the wording in here around wholly owned vehicles.
Yeah, so Councillor Ibrahim, if I understood you were asking about, is it paragraph 6.101 on page 65 of the report, and specifically why the wholly owned vehicle option wasn't mentioned here, is that? That's right, yeah. So only because what that paragraph's not trying to do is give an exhaustive list of options, it's just kind of illustrating with some of the options. Certainly not. Certainly not.
And on the final question of the legal signing, we'll take appropriate legal advice on that and continue to take that and sign it at appropriate points. Okay. If I could turn then, with those three questions, to Councillor Brabazon, Councillor Tucker... Oh, Councillor Hare, you're over there. Councillor Hare, did you have a question as well? Yeah, and I'll bring Councillor Connor, if you don't mind bringing a chair, we'll do the four.
Noah Tucker, Labour Councillor, St Anne's Ward. My first point or question is regarding the issue of the 60% overall exclusivity. Given that Lend-Lease has just been fined, I believe, £15 million because of the poor quality and very poor levels of safety of the work that they completed, I believe it was on the Old London Stock Exchange. How can within the overall exclusivity of 60%, the Council possibly manage to maintain building and safety standards while being forced to give 60% of the work to this organisation with such a poor track record? My second question is, can we please hear an answer to the question asked just a moment ago by Councillor Carter, which is a very important one. Should there be a future either change in leadership of the Council or a change of mind? A change of mind by councillors on the HDV, and it was decided that this wasn't the way forward. By that time, a substantial amount of the council's commercial property would no doubt have been placed in the hands of the HDV. How will the council be able to get that property back without having to pay extortionate prices, go into a long legal case, or pay penalties or fines?
I've got two questions and then a point of clarification, if that's okay.
If we can stick to questions, if you want to pick up points outside of the meeting,
okay,
that's fine.
I'll turn the clarification into a small question. So 2.5 questions, if that's all right. My name's Ina Brabazon. I'm Labour Councillor for Haringey Ward. My first question relates to point B in the recommendations for overview and scrutiny, and it takes us back to the member agreement in the Cabinet appendices, pages 108 to 109, which you recall, paragraph 5.4 and all those subheads has several what I might loosely call caveats about right of return. So here the overview and scrutiny is asking for a clear commitment to the prioritisation of absolute right to return. It is quite clear in reading that small print that there cannot be, if that member agreement prevails, a clear commitment. So my question is, and I asked this at the Cabinet 2.5 weeks ago, which agreement trumps which? Is it the housing policy or is it the member agreement? And it follows, if the member agreement prevails, how can we be sure that the council can have that commitment, and doesn't that lead to a, if you might call, Mexican standoff, or a situation where there will be deadlock? So perhaps you'd care to answer that. The second question relates to paragraph G, point G, which relates to the commercial portfolio. And it's regarding the situation in the commercial portfolio where there are buildings that council owns who can transfer properties where residential property is on top of these commercial properties, whether they're rented out to community groups or commercially rented, they're rented out. Can you tell me what is the position with the property transferred? So if it's a shop front for community use, which is underneath residential housing, will that property be transferred leasehold or freehold? If it's... I'm just waiting for Anne to finish. If it's transferred, would it be transferred leasehold or freehold? If freehold, what would be the implications for the flats above, which are council housing? So that's my second question. I appreciate your answer. And thirdly, can you comment on the fact that you gave an example of scrutiny, very successful scrutiny with Veolia. Can you comment on the fact that Veolia is a private company, the HDV, albeit a private company, is 50-50 owned by Haringey and therefore slightly different in forms of transparency? Thank you.
Councillor Hare.
Thank you. I'm Councillor Bob Hare, Liberal Democrat Councillor for Highgate Ward. I just make an observation that the fact that at what Councillor Wright called the end game, that we've come down to these relatively few questions, I don't think that reflects the sense that people are satisfied with the answers and that the proposals satisfy the many people who've been objecting. That's just an observation. I'd like to ask about the risk assessment, which I did also ask about a few days ago. It hasn't been done. The risk register, which you referred to, is very much a top-level list without analysis and without actions or a sense of prioritisation or scaling of risks. The assessment has been asked for time and again by scrutiny. When will it be done, and will that be before or after the expected signing of the agreement with Lend-Lease? My second question is, I also asked about carbon impacts. I wasn't happy with the answer, which was very general. Will carbon considerations have any effect on the proposals for demolition? In other words, if you looked at it and it was unsatisfactory or the costs would be too high, would you reconsider a particular demolition? I asked about leaseholders and their costs, and your answer was that, of course, they would have costs that you might not be able to cover. Do you have estimates for the average loss to leaseholders, for example, from Northumberland Park, given that you know the value of the properties there and that you know property values and rentals locally? I think you could probably calculate what the average loss would be to leaseholders. And what is that? If a future council at any stage did not wish to put further properties into the development vehicle, would Lend-Lease have the right to bring the development vehicle to an end, claiming the 10% premium which you talked about in an answer on Monday on the value of the properties in the development vehicle? On the social housing, you gave an answer to Councillor Wright earlier, But it seems to me that's a very woolly answer. I would just like to ask the simple question: what will be the number of social rent properties on Northumberland Park, given that it's a very high proportion at the moment, and will the number in future, post-development, of social rent properties be the same, more or less? And you will ask that. Okay. So those are my questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Connor.
Hi, my name is Councillor Pippa Connor. I'm actually Vice Chair on the Overview Scrutiny, and I'm a Councillor Muswell Hill Board. As we've been discussing over the scrutiny process, we all understand there is this huge need for housing, especially in Haringey. We know that we've got approximately 9,000 people on our housing waiting list, and we know that there's approximately 3,000 people in temporary accommodation, and we keep having this number of 40% of affordable housing. I would just really like to ask, have there been any discussions with Lend-Lease at any point about what the percentage of social housing would be from our position, from the council's ask, within that 40%? So it just would give councillors a really clear understanding of what we're actually going to end up with in social housing, because obviously that's a huge issue for us. And the second question I'd just like to ask on small businesses. We know that putting VAT on small business is a concern. That's going to rise the cost for them hugely. I understand it will be phased. Could you give any more clarification on how long this phasing could take place in order to mitigate this cost to our little small businesses in Haringey? Thank you.
Okay, Councillor Strickland.
Thank you very much for your questions. So, Councillor Tucker, in terms of the press article you referred to around the £50 million fine, as I understand it, and I think this has been reported in the press, that fine is not being paid by Lend-Lease, it's being paid by the glass organisation that fitted faulty glass, which I think is rather a different story to the one we got. The Council obviously takes safety standards incredibly seriously. They're looked at through the planning process, but also, of course, through the subsequent building control process. So I think members can be reassured that all of the normal safety regulations would, of course, be followed. In terms of exit provisions, if the Council changes its mind, this was gone through at length in the scrutiny meeting on Monday. So I wouldn't propose now, Claire, to go through every single one of the exit provisions, because we talked about that during our 5-hour discussion. Councillor Brabazon, so as I said earlier, I accept that there has been concern about this wording in that document, which has caused confusion, and as I mentioned, that I have instructed officers that will be redrafted to make very clear, as I said and officers have said, that the intention absolutely of those documents is to capture the fact that right to return absolutely has priority. So there's no question of sort of what trumps what, right to return trumps all. That's very clear. And I've checked that as well with the external lawyer who was involved in those documents, who said, no, that is exactly what the documents mean. But again, he's happy to clarify that further in the documents. In terms of residential property, as we've always been clear, there are lots of shops and things under Homes for Haringey blocks. It has never been suggested that Homes for Haringey blocks of homes will be transferred into HGV. In answer to your other question, the commercial portfolio being moved is on a leasehold basis. On your third point about Veolia being a private company, obviously I'm aware of that. The point I was simply making is there is precedent for scrutiny to scrutinise independent organisations to whom scrutiny does not have access to the board minutes and internal details, but still manages to conduct very effective scrutiny. Clearly, with the HGV, scrutiny will have access to much more, because, as I said, all major decisions still have to go through Cabinet and still have to go through the mainstream democratic process in a way that obviously does not apply to people like Veolia. Bob, I think as you said, the questions you've raised, many of the questions you raised on Monday, which I've already answered, and I'm sorry if you weren't happy with those answers, but I'm afraid the answers haven't changed in the last 3 days. So the first one then, on risk assessment, what I said on Monday, and what officers said on Monday, was that risk mitigation, thinking about risk and how we deal with risk, is really writ large throughout all of these documents. In fact, the very structure of the HGV is designed to mitigate risk. The fact that Cabinet is not deciding tonight to put land in, the fact that land goes in on a phased basis over a long period of time, one of the reasons for taking that structural approach is, of course, to minimise risk and to make sure that we are not, as people have claimed, putting all of our eggs in one basket. Stuff happens slowly and incrementally over time. So, as I said on Monday, I think it's not necessarily helpful to demand sort of specific documents with specific titles. The question for the Cabinet is, has the issue of risk been dealt with properly? And I'm satisfied, having obviously read all of these documents and having had extensive discussions over the last 2 years of this process, that it has been looked at properly. On the question of carbon and demolition, again, as I said on Monday, carbon is a very important consideration. I've made clear, and it says this in the paperwork, that the HGV will aim to receive C40 accreditation. C40 is a network of cities that was set up by Ken Livingstone and other mayors at the time, and that is recognised as being one of the highest and most demanding levels of accreditation for this sort of work, and that's absolutely around carbon management and sustainability. Now, as I also said on Monday, I completely understand your views and your concerns about embedded carbon, and clearly demolition does raise issues around that, but while it's very important to us, and we expect the HGV to be an exemplar in terms of carbon management. As I mentioned, there are a number of priorities here, and we obviously have to balance challenges of embedded carbon around demolition, for example, with the desperate need to give some of our tenants, brand new, modern homes fit for the 21st century, the sort of homes that they have asked for in consultation and in recent weeks in my meetings with various tenants. In terms of loss to leaseholders, we would not expect, given the provision set out in the paperwork, there will be significant financial loss to leaseholders. As I set out on Monday, Leader, the shared equity provisions which are being proposed go beyond our statutory responsibilities, are not offered by many other councils, and are a very effective package for leaseholders who want to stay in the area. In terms of housing and housing numbers, which I think you described as woolly, what I set out on Monday, which I've set out this evening, is that we have to speak to tenants. We want to speak to tenants. We've got a statutory obligation to do so further. And obviously, what we're not doing tonight is coming with detailed plans. Of course, there aren't any, because we genuinely... Always happy to, thank you, Lisa. Always happy to provide entertainment for the balcony. But as I say, as we've always said, there are no detailed physical plans. That's because, as I've said repeatedly, we have to talk to the tenants who live there, and it's in consultation with tenants that we will make decisions. And I make no apology for listening to tenants rather than people screaming from a balcony. Tenants are our priority. Councillor Connor, again on social rent, we discussed this on Monday in some detail, and what I said very clearly on Monday was if the Lib Dems were so concerned about social rent, they would not have scrapped social rent funding when they were in government. So I will not take lectures from the Lib Dems on problems with social rent when that product was scrapped by the Tory Lib Dem coalition. However, despite the appalling actions of that coalition government, as I said earlier, in our housing strategy we've made clear that we will not accept rents of up to 80% on most properties, and that housing strategy was agreed cross-party and with residents. And I'll ask Dan to answer the last question, Leader, which is on the length of phasing for VAT.
So the short answer on the question of phasing is that level of detail hasn't been arrived yet. And in fact, phasing is only one of the options we're looking at. So we're not even saying that the phasing of it is necessarily the approach that we'll take, let alone kind of over what time period and over what method.
Okay, thank you for your questions. I'm now turning back to the Cabinet. Cabinet, in accordance with the call-in procedure, having heard the responses to the scrutiny recommendations and the responses to each of the subsequent questions, can I refer you to the key decision, which is contained in the Cabinet minutes, which are included in the packet, pages 7 to 28, and in particular, can I ask you to refer to the resolutions listed at pages 21 through to 23? Now, this evening, we've reconsidered this matter. Cabinet, can you confirm to me that you're happy to agree to confirm the original decision subject to further commitments made by Councillor Strickland in response to the scrutiny recommendations? Is that agreed? Agreed. Thank you. As there are no further items of business permitted at this special meeting, the meeting is now closed. Thank you.